this presentation intends to report from one of these SURF programs, which has been running over the last 4 years. SURF, the Dutch organization in which universities cooperate, has a large program called Testing and Test-Directed Learning. I've translated it into formative assessment because I guess that in the Anglo-Saxon countries, the aim of the program is better covered by formative assessment than by the wording testing and test-directed learning. And in our part of the program, we try to connect this with learning analytics. Our part of the program was on mathematics, so we will be on that topic in later slides. And there's a cooperation with a couple of universities, as you can see on this slide. In terms of the reporting, I've molded into a study which tries to connect two things. We have studied students learning in these digital platforms and see if we can do student profiling for these students. So what type of students make what type of use of these platforms. And we try to connect it with the so-called learning dispositions approach, which was introduced by Simon Buckingham and Ruud Deacon in the LAK conference last year, which they also called learning power approach, in which they try to combine two different data sets. At the one side, the traditional data sets in learning analytics quite often is huge, which is track data generated by computers, but then the other component of the data sets is so-called intentional data generated by students making use of self-report instruments. They have proposed that in the LAK, and they also gave it a very specific approach, making use of the so-called instrument LE. We will see in a minute that we'll take an alternative approach. Now, as a last piece of introduction, this is our SURF project, being one of the many programs in the SURF, one of the many projects in the SURF program. As I indicated, its name on the twist, which is an acronym, but at least it already suggests that it might have mathematics, because the last 4 letters indicate mathematics, statistics, that has mathematics in it. So the broad aim of the program is to improve transfer for students going from high school to university, and additionally to improve study success in the very first year of the study and to diminish dropout. And the tools being used for that were online platforms for both practicing and formative assessment and low-stakes assessments. In this very specific study, I will focus to the situation in my own university, which is to describe a large and very international and very heterogeneous population. International and heterogeneous quite often go together. I'm teaching in business economics, first-year students. The very short paper in the proceedings is based upon looking at 2-year classes, one of last year and the year before. In my presentation today, I have been able to update it, so it's now looking at this year class, which contains about 1,000 students, and 80% are international students. Being international in our case implies that it's mainly from the German-speaking part of Europe. So it can be international, but then still at short distances. However, international is important because the high school systems in Europe are very, very different. There are huge differences between countries with an Anglo-Saxon tradition, countries with a German-speaking tradition, and the Netherlands is a kind of situation in between. So although distances are small, it's in terms of bridging for these students, those are sometimes huge bridges. Okay, what is the learning context? Continuing the social constructivist approach explained by the former speaker, our educational system is based on the so-called problem-based learning system, which is a system where students are taught in small groups, led by one of the students themselves, and where the teacher takes the role as a kind of coaching, the term is tutoring those students. So it's based upon this social constructive way of working. And we have, at one side, large-scale education, a lot of students, but it has 75 different classes in which those students have really small groups. And then we have the tech component, which is based on the MyLabs from Pearson. And in this run, we use 2 different MyLabs, one for learning mathematics and one for learning statistics. So the course I will describe has mathematics and statistics integrated at an introductory level. Yes, our students get 3 courses, and this is the very first one. Okay, then the so-called disposition model introduced last year by Buckingham and Deacon. We have tried measuring disposition. We have measured disposition. We made a different choice. We made a choice for so-called disposition stemming from social cognitive learning theories based upon our tradition of doing this research in terms of blended learning. And we choose for a very specific model, which is introduced in mainly the Anglo-Saxon literature by Carol Dweck, already 20, 30 years ago, which is based upon beliefs students might have in their learning. And it's a chain in the sense that there are a couple of instruments over here, a couple of concepts over here, which have an incidence-consequence relationship. And the very first one is what is called implicit theories of intelligence. And it has 2 poles. The one pole is the so-called incremental view. And the incremental view sees intelligence as a muscle. You might have low intelligence, but you can practice it, you can train it, and then you can raise your intelligence. So intelligence is not so much different as just a muscle. And the other view is the so-called entity view. And that views intelligence as a given. When you are born, you have a specific amount of intelligence. You are never being able to change that. And so these are radically different views. The research of Carol Dweck has really indicated that already very young kids might have one of these 2 views. And then there's a whole chain of other concepts which are connected to them. And so if Evert believes this is the first one, you can see effort as something negative or something positive. If you are an incremental theorist, then yes, indeed, trying to have a lot of effort is a positive thing because effort is practicing. However, if you have an entity view, then all effort just signals your lack of intelligence. So effort is a negative thing. Learning achievement goals, the learning goal or the mastery goal, you learn because you would like, because you love to learn more, to know more, is connected with the incremental view, whereas the normative performance goal, you learn because you want to show off in class that you are one of the better students, is connected to the entity view. Academic motivations, already discussed in some of these presentations in this conference, autonomous motivation versus controlled motivation, learning styles, deep versus surface learning, also the way you regulate your own learning, self-regulated, being able to regulate your learning yourself versus having the need that others, like peers or tutors, help you in regulating your learning. That's called external regulation. And then motivation and engagement, which is a relative new instrument introduced by one of the Sydney University, Andrew Martin, subjective. So this is a whole list of different instruments we used in order to find out what student dispositions are. All of them allow to distinguish the adaptive versus maladaptive aspects of learning, illustrated with this so-called motivation and engagement wheel of Andrew Martin, which has 4 different quadrants, which the adaptive one in the upper part, the maladaptive one in the lower part, the thoughts over there, and the thoughts over there, adaptive thoughts versus the maladaptive thoughts, and then the behaviors on the right upper side and the left down side. Whereas you can see that the adaptive part playing similar roles, then the maladaptive thoughts are in fact the less adaptive aspects of learning. The maladaptive behaviors are in fact the strongest maladaptive parts of behaviors, and I point to this because we will see later on that this plays an important role. Okay, that's the introduction. Then a couple of slides upon some more traditional research. In the traditional research, in terms of investigating, can we see different profiles of users of our systems? Yes, we can see clearly. If we try to make a clustering upon the use of the systems, there are two systems, one for mathematics, one for statistics, and what we can find is mastery in weekly assignments, time they need to, they spend in the weekly assignments, and since time and mastery are rather collinear, we have a third one which is we call efficiency, which is just mastery divided by time. And if we take the first two, mastery and time, over 7 weeks, by both tools, mathematics, statistics, and apply cluster analysis, we find very naturally 4 different clusters. One with very high level, cluster 4, and happily that's by large, it's the largest group. And so about 2/3 of our students are in this cluster 4. Then we have a cluster over here, which is students opting out for using e-learning. They can, because we have a system which is blended learning. So they have to go to these problem-based learning sessions, but they don't need to go to, they don't need to use this e-learning. And then 2 in-between groups, which start using the system, and then after 2 weeks or after 4 weeks, diminish the intensity. And so these are the national clusters. And the next step is that we tried to see, okay, if we have those measures of intensity of using the system, how do what is the relationship with all these dispositions? And since most of the dispositions variables are strongly collinear, we do it in a very simple way by looking at individual correlations, bivariate correlations between intensity of system using and each of these disposition variables. For instance, over here we can see these are the international students, or this is a variable, a dummy variable indicating international students, and it tells us that international students spend a lot of more time in this digital system. However, they are a lot of less efficient in this digital system, and taking the two together makes that their mastery level is about the same as the local students, slightly higher, but not very much. This is not surprising because these international students have really to make this bridge, the large bridging, the large transfer, because their math and statistics education might be very different from the math and statistics education in Dutch high school. And our program is by law based on what is taught in Dutch high school. Another example, for instance, we have over here an entry test. And what we can see is that students who score high in the entry test achieve much higher mastery in both tools, but don't spend more time. Over here they even spend less time. How can it be? Because they are much more efficient. And that's the way we can interpret all of these data. In terms of the goal setting over here, we'll see 2 important spikes, which are of the outcome goal and the learning goal. So students high in outcome goal or high in learning goal spend more time, are not more or less efficient than the other students, but since they are spending more time, they achieve higher mastery. Okay, autonomous motivation versus controlled motivation versus the last one, which is called A-motivation. A-motivation has a very nice future over here. Students who are A-motivated, that is students who are neither autonomous nor control motivated, but A-motivated, none of them, spend about the same amount of time as other students in those systems. However, they are very much less efficient in doing so, and by this inefficiency achieve lower mastery. In contrast, if we look at students who are autonomous motivated, and those are the two most important pieces of them, they spend more time, the efficiency is about the same, the mastery is much higher. They are very similar over here. Here you see the learning styles, and over there we see attitudes. In terms of learning style, we see that deep learners have in fact zero correlations. That means that deep learners don't need these digital tools as other types of learners would need that. And that's not surprising because deep learners have get sufficient material, get sufficient knowledge in this PBL session, so they don't need that much the scaffolding of these. What we see that the type of learners which mostly need the systems are apparently students which need external regulation. So apparently our PBL session doesn't provide them with sufficient regulation of their study, and they need the digital system for external regulation. This is the very last slide. It doesn't relate to the dispositions, but relates to course performance. These are very high correlations, indicating that this MyLab use, my StatLab, my MATLAB use, this correlates quite highly with the different course performances. And so that gives us the motivation effect also to look at these clusters of system use, because the system use is really a very good predictor of course performance. And so realizing that, trying to make the step now to learning analytics, can we predict what students will be in which of these clusters? And we try to predict these two different sets. One set is the traditional track data, and then we only use very early track data. So in this example, the track data of week 1, and here combined with the track data of week 2. And then we confront it with the other type of data, that's the disposition data. And we see that if we start using disposition data, we can give a partial explanation. Track data gives somewhat more explanation. A jumped explanation is made when we combine disposition data and track data. In fact, this is relatively seen a good model because it only takes information up to week 1, and then on that basis of that tries to predict which students belong to which of these groups. And we see that the two types of data are rather complementary. What track data can do quite well is predict this cluster 1, which is not surprising because the cluster 1 students are those students who in fact opt out for using the system already in week 1. What disposition data adds is some explanation, not too high, but some explanation in those two in-between clusters. And so the main message is over here that apparently we have two data sets which have a very complementary information in there. That's kind of similar to a lecture we had yesterday on prediction models by the lecture by Wolf. So he had kind of similar results. Okay, 2 slides in terms of, okay, knowing this, what do we do with these data? The system track data is fed back to the students in a continuous way with weekly overviews to our tutors. The dispositional data is once sent in by students, also fed back to the students, and we try to develop some graphical tools, kind of primitive, but we make use of the graphical tools of Excel by purpose, since our students also get a training in using Excel. And then as very last one, we have been using a lot of instruments in this study, and the question is, do you need all of those instruments? And the answer is no. if you are really using this system, so the Buckingham Crick system, the Beacon system, only for trying to improve learning, then it's in fact you only need variables like the motivation engagement wheel and learning styles. However, if you would like this system to interventions for counseling, then it's interesting to know that these variables are connected, for instance, with entity or incremental views by students, because you can have an intervention on entity or incremental views and much more difficult on these variables. And so yes, you need all of these instruments if you really like to use this information in terms of counseling applications. If only for steering the learning process, you can do with much less information. And the next challenge we have is, okay, now that we feed back all this information to the students, can we, one way or the other, find out how effective this is? But how can we make a system that students, where we can see what students do with this feedback, and can we see if it improves their learning or not? Okay, that's it.
Thanks, Matt. Questions, please.
So I have a few questions. Your representative is quite interesting, and you're trying to collect all these different instruments. I haven't seen that you cited some of these specific instruments, but I suppose you use some of these already established instruments. So my question is more related, how can we better instrument the existing learning systems so that we actually non-intrusively collect these dispositions without asking students to self-report them, but rather to actually use them or derive them from the trace data that existing learning systems are already collecting?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Yeah, but the proposal of last year by Simon Buckingham, was not to have the system based only on tracking data, because sure, you can try to track some of these variables, but also to complement it with other type of data. And in making these models, you can see that there is a good reason to do so, because these are really complementary sources.
I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying how can we build better systems? Because we know from psychology research that self-reports are inaccurate. They basically are static. They basically represent one specific time period. So, for example, there is plenty of research, for example, in achievement goal theory, and also in self-efficacy. Students, after some assessment, they basically may have certain expectations, but we know also, for example, from self-regulated research, their self-efficacy can be very overconfident. And basically, if you use one snapshot of self-efficacy or achievement goal orientation, and then another moment in time, their self-efficacy changes. That's basically what we know from psychology research, right? And therefore, you know, there's a need actually to collect more dynamic data, not just one snapshot. So my question would be more, how can we actually better instrument systems so that we can collect all these dispositions, but at many measurement points?
I still give the same answer as I gave before, in the sense that to the extent that self-report data are not true data, the true aspect of them probably we already measure from other data, system data, track data. And if students give non-true answers to self-report instruments, apparently there is some information in there. Otherwise, these prediction models couldn't do that well. And for instance, one of the things which is very nice is over here is in this maladaptive behavior, what we find is that there are nice gender differences in this self-report data, where if females have maladaptive aspects, it's our maladaptive thoughts, whereas if boys have maladaptive aspects, it are maladaptive behaviors. And that's a crucial difference, because the maladaptive thoughts are in fact only pushing people to use the systems more, whereas the maladaptive behaviors are really the worst thing you can have, because it blocks you from using the systems. So apparently these self-report instruments are catching such a thing that males and females are apparently different in terms of these maladaptiveness. So I do think that the value of self-report data is higher than in the type of reports you just described.
I didn't describe any of these. Anyway,
you refer to...
I refer to more dynamic measurement, not just
Sure.
one starting point.
Yeah.
Anyways, any further questions? None? Okay, thanks much.
Yeah, okay.